Today we're talking about Old Hickory, and that is the nickname for Andrew Jackson when he was a general. And so we're going to pick him up as president, and he's still Old Hickory. He hasn't changed. We've talked about him a little bit, in that he kind of does what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. That is how he is going to be as president of the United States. He's a my way or the highway kind of a guy, and that's how he runs things. In fact, he doesn't even like to be called Mr. President. He wants to be called General Jackson during his 2 terms in office. And he is extraordinarily popular. Now, he is the first Westerner to be president. So we've had guys from Massachusetts and guys from Virginia. Those are kind of the founding fathers, right? Now we have Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. And so this will then begin to open up the possibility of more people from the West as it moves across the country becoming president. So we'll see that more and more and more. So again, Jackson kind of brings his own special flavor to the presidency, and a lot of times you'll see a term called Jacksonian democracy. He does kind of usher in this new Democrat Party out of the era of good feelings when it seemed like we finally fixed the problems and we were down to one party. Well, what that did is it fractured the party that was left, Jefferson's Republican Party, into multiple other parties. And for a while, everyone will be a Democrat, but then we'll have several other parties that come on. Some will be successful, some won't be. Ultimately, there'll be a new Republican Party that challenges this Jacksonian Democrat Party. And of course, that'll get us into the Civil War as part of the problems there. But a couple of things about Jackson before we get into some specific events that happened during his presidency is one is the spoils system. I think everyone is basically aware that when a president or a governor or a CEO, which is essentially what a president and a governor is, when they take office or they take power, they're going to put people who they trust into positions of authority. So we see that every time we get a new president, they're going to change the Secretary of State, they're going to change the Secretary of Defense, and something like that. They might not change the Secretary of Labor or the Secretary of Energy. Probably, it just depends, right? But they're definitely going to change the big chairs because they want people that they think will do things the way they want. And so Jackson is no different, but Jackson sort of takes us to another level in that he's going to use the spoil system to reward people who got him elected, but also kind of hammer or destroy people who didn't. So if you were on his side and you did what he wanted you to do and you helped get him elected, he's going to find a job for you. He's going to appoint you somewhere in the government. Maybe real high, maybe real low. That's all up to him, but he's going to give you a job. And if you were against him, he's going to try to wipe you out. Not just get rid of you, not just move you out of the way, but he's going to try to damage your reputation or destroy your career. That's Andrew Jackson. He tends to be vindictive and holds a lot of grudges. But the other thing he believes in is rotation. He hates bureaucracy. And I know that's probably ironic because he's a lifelong soldier, a great general, and then he became a governor, so a politician, and you'd think those two guys love bureaucracy. Well, he's that kind of soldier that did things his way and didn't really worry about the paperwork. And he's sort of that way as president too. And the idea of rotation is you might give someone a job because of the spoil system, but he's not going to let you keep that job for a really long period of time where you can ensconce yourself or build yourself in. We've all had experience with bureaucracies, right? You become a number. The people working in the bureaucracy aren't about really helping you. They're about maintaining their position and maintaining their territory, maintaining their little castle, if you will. And so they build all this red tape and so on around their position, and they're going to do everything to maintain their job and less maybe to help you. And he feels like that's super inefficient, which it is, and that leads to a lot of corruption, which it does. And so he very much will change people out. So if you're still on his good side a couple years in, then he'll give you a new job. He'll move you out and do something else. Of course, that's also inefficient in many ways because people have to relearn jobs. You should kind of be aware that our government is deliberately inefficient, right? The founding fathers, remember, were deathly afraid of building a government that would then take too much power. And I know here we are in 2020, we could argue, and probably rightly so, that it has taken a lot of power that was unintended. That's a whole discussion for your government class, probably. But the fact is, it does that, and he doesn't want to see that. He's kind of a smaller government believer, although no president ever is really that small of a government kind of a guy. So rotation is his way to try to help correct that. And again, in a system that's already designed to be inefficient, designed to move slowly, it works. So that's just sort of basically in general how Jackson works. Now, there are three things that we're going to talk about specifically that happened during his presidency. And one of them is the Indian Removal Act, which was signed by him in 1830. And it's actually something that had been in the works for years and years. And you can see on this map, this isn't all of them, but these are the big major tribes. And essentially what the Indian Removal Act did was it said, we're going to move all of the native tribes east of the Mississippi, and we're going to move them into that area you see that's in the green on this map called the Indian land. So basically like Oklahoma, right? And some of them will stay in Arkansas and so on, and they're not all going to go there. But remember, there's already natives there, and of course there's huge numbers of other natives in Texas and this whole region, the Comanche, the Sioux, and others. So that we're going to cram all these Indians into this place we call the Indian lands or the Indian territories. So all these pink regions are where these major tribes came from: the Seminole, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Sauk and Fox from the north. And you can see there's some battles up there that took place. Some will try to fight, but the army goes in, and again, you'll see this in one of your documentaries, they'll move them out. Some people just give up and go. Other people, like the Cherokee, kind of try to fight this in court and try to adapt and adjust. And they have some good helpers like General Sam Houston, way before he's a general in Texas. He's an honorary member of the Cherokee tribe. His name is the Raven. He's a friend, and he is also a friend of Andrew Jackson. And he'll try, and he's a congressman for a while, he'll try to get some relief for some of these people. But ultimately, it's not going to happen. And so they're going to just basically at gunpoint move all of these people, thousands of people, from their homes. And remember, these are ancestral homes for the most part, which they've already been reduced to because of all these various treaties. And then they're going to be moved into this region. And it's not going to be done well necessarily. Some cooperate, some don't. You're talking men and women, old people and children. The Cherokee especially, a lot of people are going to die. We call that the Trail of Tears. But this affects all of these groups. It's all going to be pretty ugly and very difficult. And it's one of the reasons why Jackson is kind of looked on as a very non-politically correct president. And he's on your $20 bill, and there's always talk about removing him from your $20 bill. And a lot of it has to do with this particular part. Now, you might ask, why are we moving all this? Is it a racial thing? Yeah, that's part of it. And keep in mind, natives are not viewed as citizens of the United States. They're foreigners. They're sort of like orphans, and they're just now part of the system. But there's a bigger issue in that, and we've already discussed the cotton boom. So a bigger issue here is these Indians, these natives, occupy huge tracts of potential farmland, and the governments and the business people want it. And so I think it really comes down to that. And so Jackson will be the president who does it. He's not necessarily unhappy about it. He's certainly not a big friend of Indians himself. He's been fighting with them his entire life in Tennessee. So he makes it happen. And so this gives a pretty black eye to his career, even though, as we mentioned earlier, he's hugely popular among the people. And again, you got to kind of understand timing. We don't live in the 1830s. People thought very, very differently about things in the 1830s. They thought very differently about slavery, even Northerners who are beginning to not like it. We'll get to that later. They thought very differently about natives, about immigrants, about everything. And we just have to be careful that we're not applying all of our sensibilities to what they would have been thinking. So that's the one thing. The second thing is this thing we call the Battle of the Bank. And you may recall we talked about the Bank of the United States being formed by Alexander Hamilton and coming into big disagreements with Thomas Jefferson. And those disagreements led to our political parties, again, disagreeing on how the Constitution should be applied. Well, that bank, the charter ran out. Congress rechartered it in 1816, and it's going to come up for recharter again in 1836. And why that's important is because if Jackson wins a second term, which we know he will, there's a good chance that he's not going to sign the recharter of the bank because Jackson does not support the bank. He thinks it's a bad idea. He thinks it's intrusive. He doesn't like the way it works. He thinks because no one in the bank is an elected official, the bank doesn't answer to the government, that's wrong. So very much like Jefferson in that respect. So this becomes a huge issue in the 1832 election when Henry Clay, his mortal enemy, another Westerner, those guys are kind of interesting because they're almost like the same guy, but because they're the same guy, they can't stand each other. And so you'll have the Democrat Jackson, very strong personality, versus this guy Henry Clay, who also is a Westerner and also has a very strong personality. And they believe a lot of the same things, but politically they're going to end up on opposite sides. And Clay is going to develop a new political party called the Whig Party, and you have to say the H in there when you say it. It's WHIG, the Whig Party, and they're an anti-Andrew Jackson party essentially in the beginning. So he runs in 1832 and he makes the bank the big issue, and he says if Jackson wins, he's going to kill the bank, and that's going to ruin the economy. And Jackson basically says, I am going to kill the bank and our economy will be fine. Jackson, of course, wins. And then when Jackson does win, keep in mind, this is a charter by Senate that was signed by, I guess, James Madison, or who would that be in 1816? Probably James Madison. And there's nothing he can do about it. It doesn't come up for recharter till 1836. But what Jackson does instead is he has all the money removed from the Bank of the United States, and all the new money is diverted from the Bank of the United States into other banks, state banks, and so on. He's not opposed to banks. He just doesn't like this gargantuan Bank of the United States. So what that does is it makes the Bank of the United States essentially go bankrupt. Now, it still has a charter. Eventually it'll get reformed, but eventually it will go under. And it does cause some real problems in the economy. But at that point, in 1837, basically Jackson's already gone. And so this is a huge issue that maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you or to me because we're used to the Federal Reserve and banking is such a big part of all of our lives. But it was, to him, a very important constitutional thing. Well, this led to the Panic of 1837, which we'll talk about later in a few minutes. But when Jackson was asked later in life, what was the greatest thing you did as president? He said, I killed the bank. So it was very important to him that he do away with that. So that's the second thing. The third thing has to do with this nullification crisis, which has to do with South Carolina. So first of all, we got to set the stage. Jackson's vice president is John Calhoun, who was, and then later on, again, will be a congressman from South Carolina. He's very vocal. He's very well respected. He's also been Secretary of War. He's held a whole bunch of posts for several presidents. And he is, and most Southerners are hugely against these tariffs that the government continues to pass. The 1828 tariff, or tariff of abominations, is again, tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. And northern states tend to like tariffs because it helps protect their industry, the iron industry or the lumber industry or what have you. But southern states, agricultural states, tend to hate the tariffs because it does tend to raise prices on things. And they don't appreciate that. So they call it the tariff of abominations. Keep in mind, he's the vice president. He knows exactly what's going on. And so while he's doing that, he basically writes a document that proposes how states could nullify laws that the federal government passes. This is an idea that Thomas Jefferson brought up way back in 1798, but never really pursued. Well, Calhoun's going to pursue it, and he essentially says the way that a state can do this is to have its own convention, kind of like they had when they had a convention to either pass or not pass the Constitution. They have the similar kind of convention, and they vote on a law, in this case, the tariff. Well, of course, South Carolina, his home state, does it. And in 1832, they voted to nullify these tariffs. They said they are unconstitutional, they're unenforceable, and we're not going to collect that. Now, the rest of the southern states all would agree with that, but no one jumped on board. They've all got their popcorn, and they're watching to see what happens. Well, Jackson's super angry. Jackson says, well, we might have to invade South Carolina, but at the same time, he's not an idiot. He does send in the negotiators, and they do work out a deal. They do pass a compromise tariff in 1833, but they also pass something called the Force Bill, which is more explicit in saying that the president, the executive branch, has power to collect taxes in states, and they can use force to do such. And so, from one perspective, this South Carolina nullification seems to be a win because they got the tariff reduced and they got it changed. And of course, then South Carolina voted, okay, we're not going to do that. So it averted a possible war catastrophe. But at the same time, this force bill actually gives the government more power to collect taxes. So in the end, it's kind of a loss. But this was a big deal. This could have ended in war. None of the other southern states joined. Now, here's a funny little thing that happens, though, because I would guarantee you that if Andrew Jackson were governor of Tennessee still in 1832, he would have totally been on board with what South Carolina was doing. But because he's president of the United States now, he has a different view of how everything works. And so he is against this as president because he believes it's disunity by force. In fact, he will say disunity by force is treason. Jackson loses a lot of support from his Southern friends because he took that stance. Now, he's already in his second term when this stuff happens, or he's already won his second term anyway. And so it's not as if he really is that worried about it. I don't think he'd be that worried about it anyway. But it is interesting to see how people's mindset changes depending on what level they are in the government and where they are in the structure of power. And part of that's, because they see how things work differently. So just interesting. Again, if he were governor, he would have been all over this, might have even joined. So those are the three major things that took place: this Indian removals, the bank war, and the nullification crisis that will take place in Jackson's presidency. Now, on the other side, the economy continues to boom. People keep moving west. The air of good feelings, in many ways, is still progressing, and Jackson will be able to actually pay off all of the debt of the United States. So for a very brief period of time, in the 1830s, we will have no debt. All that's going to change with the Panic of 1837, and then, of course, we're going to have a couple of wars after that. So for a brief time, it was doable, it was possible. Well, he steps down after 2 terms, as presidents do, again, by tradition. And so we elected Martin Van Buren, who was his second vice president. And in fact, Van Buren's the last vice president to become president until 1988, when George H.W. Bush did it as Ronald Reagan's vice president. It's super rare. It's only happened 4 times, 5 if you count Nixon, but Nixon had a long 8-year layoff in between his vice presidency and presidency. So we had Adams and Jefferson, and now Van Buren in 1836 win an election. That vice president just doesn't win elections. They become president because somebody gets killed or dies. They don't win elections. Well, Van Buren comes along. You can see the picture of Van Buren. He's a completely different looking guy than Jackson. Jackson's this soldier, this warrior, this sort of Southern gentleman, this Westerner, and then here you got Martin Van Buren, whose nickname was the Red Fox because he was devious yet honest. I mean, how perfect is that to be a politician? But he was not Andrew Jackson. I would describe him as a city slicker, where Jackson is this, again, rugged sort of mountain man kind of a guy. Not that he wasn't also a gentleman, but you got a New Yorker versus a Westerner Tennessean, and he doesn't have the same personality. He doesn't pursue things the way Jackson does. And so he's not Andrew Jackson, and people aren't really happy with that. Keep in mind, now elections are more and more in the public eye. That started in the 1820s, and now almost every state is having some kind of popular election that's going to influence how those electoral college votes are done. And so people just compare Van Buren to Jackson, and he doesn't compare favorably, much like people compared John Adams to George Washington. So he just wasn't the guy. And then, of course, anytime there's an economic downturn, the president gets all the blame. Van Buren will get all the blame for the Panic of 1837, even though probably most of it is due to closing the Bank of the United States, which he would have done too, but Jackson did it. Now, there are other issues going on, so it's not all in the lap of Jackson or closing the bank. There are some worldwide issues, but closing the bank makes those issues become much worse, especially in the United States. So other banks shut down, businesses go under, people lose their jobs. This is a nationwide depression. We talk about the Great Depression, of course, in the 1930s in U.S. History 1302. That's a big topic. But there are a number of other depressions that happened before that. Each one gets progressively larger and progressively worse. So this is pretty much the first one. There was one, during the Embargo Act, but this one's going to be far worse. And basically, Van Buren says, well, I'm sorry that's happening. It's not the government's place to help or do anything specific, which again, you and I would look at and go, whoa, wait a minute, that's not true. I mean, our government just passed 2 gigantic stimulus bills to help businesses and individuals in this COVID-19 quarantine that we're in, where a lot of businesses are going under. They would have never done that. Our founding fathers would have said, nope, that's not what the government's for. Again, a lot of things have changed. Right or wrong, you can have whatever opinion you want on that. And again, discuss that in Dr. Temple's government class. But it is what happens, and things do change. So Van Buren gets blamed for it, plus he's just not Jackson. And so that kind of leads us to the 1840 election, which is a special, unique election. And what's going to happen is Van Buren's going to run again, of course. But this new Whig party that Henry Clay has is going to choose William Harrison to be their candidate. It's kind of funny because this is an election Henry Clay probably would have won if he had just run himself. But everyone's so involved in this new campaign, which is a great deal about image. In other words, what they're saying is, we need to find someone who's like Andrew Jackson because that's what the people want. That's the kind of guy that the people are going to vote for and then hopefully will make a good leader, right? So Harrison was, as we'll talk about in a minute, was a general, is a war hero. His campaign is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was a great battle that Harrison won as a general. John Tyler is the vice president, kind of a Southerner. So we're linking everything together. And so Harrison, he's kind of massaged into this image of Andrew Jackson. He wasn't Andrew Jackson. He was similar in some ways to Andrew Jackson, but not in every way. Again, he had the military record, which you can't fake. He was a decorated veteran, all these things. But he was an older guy. People kind of made fun of him for that. Said he was old, he was slow. Well, he's just not Andrew Jackson. Jackson had a very, very out there personality. So Van Buren's painted as we mentioned earlier, the city slicker, the wealthy snob, the elitist, and then Harrison is made into this image of Andrew Jackson. So the Log Cabin campaign is really all about image. That's the idea of the cabin, the hard cider. This is a rough and tumble Westerner. And the reality is that's not really who Harrison is, but it is what the people want to vote for. Now, unfortunately for Harrison, in all of this campaigning, he was, again, kind of looked at as old. He was 67. That's pretty old, especially in those times. He was viewed as kind of slow. He wasn't. He was very intelligent. He just didn't have that super outgoing personality like others have, and that makes a difference. And, again, he fought Tecumseh, which was a great Indian chief, and he fought in the War of 1812 and all these other battles. But the mistake he makes, and this might show a little bit of lack of wisdom, is he gives the longest inaugural address in our history, almost 2 hours. And it's March. Presidents took office in March back then. It's Washington. It's very cold. It's rainy. He ends up getting pneumonia and dying 1 month later. So kind of to prove how vigorous and smart he was, he gives this long, great speech, but he gets sick and he dies. So he is our shortest serving president by a mile. He served about 31 days before he died. His vice president then will become the next president. And this will be the first time that we lose a president while they're in office, and no one quite knows what to do. But that'll be the subject of our next lecture when we talk about Texas. And so we'll kind of pick that up when the time is right. So Harrison dies. But again, the thing you want to remember about the Log Cabin campaign is it was about creating a presidential image. And think about it. That's what we do now. It's about image. And they had to make them look good in the newspapers and so on. When radio comes out, you got to be able to handle yourself on the radio. When television came out, candidates now have to be able to handle themselves on television. Think John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. And now with social media, think Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And whatever you say about those guys, they use social media and they seem to be doing pretty well at it. And so that's just the reality. And part of that goes back to the image that they're trying to project to America to get votes. That never really happened before because they never really campaigned before until you get to Harrison. Now, one other thing we want to talk about during this period of time is reform movements. Okay, that era of good feelings not only brought out this great economy and this great, westward expansion and this long period of peace. We paid off our debts and so on. The era of good feelings, because of all that, brings out this sort of idea, this feeling in America that we can do anything. We can fix anything. We can take care of any problem. We just have to put our minds to it. We have to put our thoughts on it, and we have to reform things. And think about it. America, we reformed government, right? We have a lot of reformation already present in our religious and political side of things. And so that's going to really come to the forefront here in the 1830s and 40s primarily. Now that'll kind of change for a while, right? We'll have a civil war, people will be busy doing other things, and then we'll come back to reform movements again in the post-Civil War period. So a lot of these early reform movements, a lot of the reform movements that really don't come to fruition until the late 1800s or even into the 20th century are born here in this period of time in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And again, another reason why we could call it the era of good feelings. So there's a number of them. So one is abolition. That is the anti-slavery movement. It's been around almost from the beginning. Many of our founding fathers felt like slavery would go away. It didn't. We talked about that already. Cotton kind of changed all that. But abolition is one of those movements that naturally all your slaves are for it, but they're not active in it. But more and more as time passes, more and more people, especially Northerners, start to become engaged in an anti-slave kind of movement. And so it's called abolition. So it starts very, very small, and it picks up speed in the 40s, but really it's the 1850s and, of course, the duration of the Civil War where this really takes off, all right? And so some of the big individuals who are in it, William Lloyd Garrison is this northern guy who wants immediate abolition right now. It's morally wrong. He prints newspapers. He gets beat up. He's very radical. There are other reformers who would say, yes, we need to do away with slavery, but it needs to be a gradual thing. And keep in mind that in Europe, in the 1830s, England is going to do away with slavery. And so there's already a movement afoot in the world to start looking at these things. But also remember that this makes Southerners who own slaves, or who most don't actually own slaves, but they're part of the system, it makes them paranoid and fearful that eventually this is going to be taken away. And so as the decades progress into the 1850s, that fear and paranoia starts to manifest itself as, well, we got to do something different. And then ultimately, we got to leave the Union and create our own country to protect this way of life of slavery. So this is something that's building. So again, that war, the Civil War, is, especially from the Southern perspective, all about slavery. All right. Harriet Tubman, of course, famous runaway slave woman who helped hundreds of slaves escape over the years. Frederick Douglass, we'll talk more about him later, also is a runaway slave who was educated. I already mentioned that in previous lecture. He's the worst nightmare for these southern slave owners because he can articulate everything that's wrong with slavery. And so you have this abolition movement growing. Now, I will say here again, I mentioned earlier, we got to be careful, about putting our modern morals and sensibilities on people. Here's the way most Northerners would have felt about slavery. And I include Abraham Lincoln in this, and many people who would come out against slavery very heavily later. It was, slavery is a problem, slavery is not good, it's ugly, and so on, but it happens down there in the South, and it's really not something that I'm involved in. But remember, economically, it's all tied together, right? If you work in factories in the North and you hate slavery, the reality is all of the cotton you're getting is coming from slave labor. So you don't necessarily connect all the dots here. And so people would say, I don't like slavery and I think it's bad, we need to do something about it. But not a lot of people are going to do it. But they wouldn't necessarily say, I think everybody's equal. Okay, and so those are two very separate issues. Slavery is one thing, equality is another thing. We're going to fix the one, but not the other, at least as far as this class is concerned. And so just remember, that's how the bulk of people thought. Lincoln thought that way. He comes around on it later as he gets older and as he becomes president, but he's typical of most people. Okay, another movement, another reform movement is the temperance movement. It's an anti-alcohol movement. And what you see here is a cartoon of a woman named Carrie Nation, who was kind of famous for going into saloons and bars and tearing the place up. You can just kind of see the bartender kind of hiding and the whole place is smashed up. So some of these women became infamous because they would go into these places and tear them up. And what these women were doing were they were fighting against alcohol. Alcohol was super prevalent. People drank way more, like 2 or 3 times more alcohol in the 1830s than they do today. And I don't know about you, but that's hard to imagine. So they drank way more. And there was zero regulation on it. And so what they're doing is they're saying this is a huge problem. Alcohol causes all sorts of social problems. Poverty, abuse. That could be spousal abuse, child abuse. It causes certainly financial abuse, and a lot of other crimes. And they rightly connect the dots on all these things. And so these women are, largely women involved, are campaigning against alcohol. One of the groups is the American Temperance Union, but there are groups everywhere. And again, they're fighting against this real big problem. And as time passes, we'll start getting regulations, minimum ages and when you can and can't sell, when you can and can't consume, different laws like that. Things we're totally used to now didn't exist back here in the 1830s. And so the temperance movement gets bigger and bigger as goes on. Ultimately, we'll get prohibition in the 20th century, but it's really less due to the temperance movement and more due to business saying, hey, we don't want alcohol in the factories anymore, because people would take whiskey breaks like they might take smoke breaks today. If you can imagine operating heavy equipment after having drunk whiskey or rum or what have you. All right, another movement, another reform movement is called the Common School Movement. And the idea here is a very Jeffersonian democratic idea that education is essential to the success of democracy, that people need to have more than just the ability to basically read and write. They need more than that. And so there are a number of elements that go into this, but generally speaking, education is going to have to be something that's made available to everyone and then sort of mandated. So you see a picture here of a guy named Horace Mann, and I hope it doesn't surprise you that this is all going to begin in Massachusetts and New England, where they really valued education from the beginning of the colonial period far more than the people who went to the South did. And so Horace Mann is from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is going to come up with a bunch of rules. And so he comes up with these ideas like, we need better trained teachers and we need to pay teachers more. I mean, previously teachers were just people who had nothing better to do, or maybe the old widow woman, and so you just gave them the teaching job. And so he says, no, this needs to be done better. There needs to be standard curriculum that all the kids are going to learn. And it needs to be developed in a way that makes sense. And I know that's a question every generation, but the idea here is everyone in the state or the community will be learning the same things. We'll have a baseline level of education. And so along with that then comes mandatory attendance. We got to have the kids go. Now, this is mostly going to be an urban thing. You're not going to see this among farm kids. Farm kids are working the farms and they go to school far less regularly than the city kids. And of course, the racial issue is dividing this up as well. So Horace Mann is kind of the forefront of developing that. If you go into the education field, I promise you will read and study about Horace Mann. But another area where education is reformed is about educating people who are blind or deaf or have other sorts of physical type handicaps, because they didn't know what to do with those people before. And so people are beginning to develop ways to teach people who can't hear, can't see, etc. And we all know it can be done because it's done all the time now. And so just the idea that you can help these people as part of this era of good feelings, reform-mindedness, that they are people too, and there is a certain level of equality that can be found in education. Again, it's one thing to go deaf in your old age, or go deaf because you were an artilleryman. They're all deaf, right? It's another thing to be born deaf or born blind, and they just didn't know how to handle that. So that's again another element here of school reform. Prison reform, they were locking people up. Sometimes they were locking insane people with criminals. Of course, sometimes they're one and the same. They just didn't know what to do with them. And so prisons are going to then be reformed to kind of clean up the situation. And they're calling penitentiaries. And you see the word penitent in there, repentant. And the idea of a penitentiary is to make you go there because you committed a crime, but make you not ever want to go back. And they try to teach you to reform. They put you to work, and a lot of it's pretty rough. But the idea was they want to reform you so you don't go back. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. And prisons today are much, much nicer than they were back then. And again, there were abuses, and this is something that's in constant flux and reform all the time. But the idea was we'll put people in this place, not to lock them away forever, but to get them to reform. By the way, the idea of reform schools also comes about during this period of time. So we get kids that are bad, incorrigible. We can put them in these very strict kind of schools that are designed not as much to educate them, but to change their behavior. And then you get to asylums, reform care for the mentally ill. Again, no one knew what to do with them. And they get them out of the prisons and they get them in their own facilities. And yes, many are still locked up. And yes, there's some really horrible things that happen in both of these cases. Dorothea Dix is one of the big proponents of reforming mental care. And of course, if you're like me, the word asylum just creeps you out anyway, because all the old asylums were creepy. And they're way better today, although there's still real challenges about what to do with people who cannot take care of themselves, who cannot function in a normal way. And so the idea, though, behind all of this is that we can make a difference. We can help and fix or correct or at least partially change how some of these people are doing. And of course, one of the underlying chunks to all of this is that many of the people involved in these reform movements are women. They tend to be middle-class women. The reason that is true is because these are women who have both the time and the means to put into these movements. Poor women, working-class women, are working all the time, and so they don't have the money or the time to put into this. These middle-class and wealthier women are going to be the ones who are at the forefront of these things. They're the foot soldiers of most of these movements, because again, most of the men are also working. So it's only natural then that the women themselves would also develop their own movement, the women's movement. And so two major things these women are going for is like property rights, equality in marriage, things like that. And then, of course, the right to vote. And these are things that property rights and so on will gradually come to fruition. Women will not officially permanently win the right to vote in the entire country until 1920 in the 19th Amendment. They will be voting in localities and states going forward into this point. So this is where those women are focusing. But again, it's only natural that they would do that because so many of these foot soldiers in these other reform movements are women. Now, one last thing here. I call it the backwoods utopias. This was the name one of our old textbooks gave it, and I like it. It seems like it's a bad name, but it's really just describing what is happening. So we have talked about all these other reform movements, and there are also going to be a whole bunch of religious reformers too, as there always are. But these are reformers who are trying to create a new utopian society. Utopia is a word that means perfection. Imagine having a society where everything is perfect. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But these individuals and these groups are really going to try. Your book mentions a whole bunch of them. I'm just going to give you 2 examples here. The challenge they run into, though, is in order to create a new society or a utopian society, they have to remove themselves from the current one. And that means they have to move out into the middle of nowhere. That's why the backwoods label is here. And so they are backwoods utopias. These groups will move out into the wilderness and try to recreate or create their own utopian culture. So 2 examples, the Shakers and the Mormons. The Shakers, you see probably a much newer photograph of the Shakers. And notice they're all old. These people may have been Shakers at this period of time. But the Shakers were very religious. They believed that the return of Christ was imminent. And so they moved kind of into these communes, and they separated males and females, and celibacy was supposed to be practiced. And, they kind of enclosed themselves off and devoted themselves to prayer and these different things. And they came up with a bunch of, ways of living, but they were super different. And they couldn't do that in the middle of everyone else. So they left. They went out into mostly in New York, but there are Shakers, a few, still around. And they're different than Quakers and Mennonites, but there's some relationship there. And then, of course, the Mormons, same thing. Joseph Smith has these visions, and some of the visions and some of the things he's told to do in the visions are very different than what Christianity accepts. One of those, for example, being polygamy. And so he can't do that within the confines of, again, society. So they have to leave. And ultimately, he's killed, but the Mormons some of them end up in Salt Lake City, some of them are in Kentucky, and still around. So the idea, though, remember, is they're trying to create a better society. And to do that, they're not reforming the one they're in. They're leaving it to create a new utopia. So backwoods utopias. So that all is coming in the context, again, of this era of good feeling. So our next lecture, we're going to talk Texas. And I know 2 or 3 of you who are native Texans are excited about this. The rest of you are probably like rolling your eyes like, oh, here we go again. But now, we'll talk about Texas. We'll talk about John Tyler and how that plays out. We got Texas. We got another war, Mexican war. We got a bunch of stuff going on. So that is going to be the topic. So stay tuned.